Every fall, schools, libraries, bookstores, and other places that promote literature and education across the country come together to celebrate this concept of Banned Books Week. And if you've never celebrated Banned Books Week before, basically what that is a week for recognizing books that have been either outright banned from being allowed to be in school curricula, or books that school libraries have chosen not to put on their shelves because of the content and things like that.
It's time to burn some books!
Looking at those books, talking about whether those books may actually provide positive educational experiences for kids and adults alike, and what it might mean to unban those books or to make sure that those books are available and accessible to as many readers as want to get access to them. I'm a person who has worked with Banned Books Week professionally before. Back when I was in grad school, I was a graduate assistant in my school's writing center, and we did a lot of programming for Banned Books Week, specifically surrounding celebrating reading as many books and getting as many books into people's hands as possible, even if those books have content that was considered questionable. And often that questionable content came from a place of like parents being afraid for their kids to learn that LGBTQ people exist, or a book that doesn't portray the US in the most positive light, or something like that, would often be books that would be banned or challenged in different ways. Now, what it means necessarily for a book to be banned or a book to be challenged can vary based on the specific institution that you're talking about, and we are going to get into the differences and the nuances of this situation today. But I especially want to talk about the importance of free speech, freedom of the press, the importance of accessible literature to people of all ages, and what that means for people who are growing up and developing a love of reading and a love of stories, and what a lot of book bans are doing that can be harmful to young people and adults alike. And that is what we are going to be talking about throughout today's video. So let's talk about it. Before we continue with today's video, first, we have a quick word from our sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Vite Ramen, a high-protein brand of instant ramen noodles that I have been loving to eat for lunch. I have mentioned so many times on this channel at this point how I do not have time to cook. I just don't. Sometimes people ask me, Savvy, how do you balance writing, making videos, running a business, doing freelance work, going to the gym so much, etc.? Well, for one thing, I don't cook, which is why I absolutely love finding brands like Vite Ramen that allow me to make quick meals that also give me lots of protein. It won't surprise you to know that high protein foods are kind of my favorite in general, especially since I love going to the gym so much and walking around in my muscle mommy hoodie. You can't be a muscle mommy if you don't eat protein. You just can't. Vite Ramen packets contain up to 31 grams of protein per packet, which is just around the amount that I'm looking for in an individual meal. It comes in lots of fun flavors like garlic pork tonkatsu, roasted soy sauce chicken, and vegan white miso. Yes, it even has meat-free options like the vegan white miso, which can be great for my vegetarian and vegan friends out there who are trying to get more protein into their diets as well. Vite Kitchens also offers Naked Nudes, which I think is the funniest name for a product ever, which are high-protein noodles without seasoning, so you can add your own flavors and create your own ramen masterpiece if you so choose. Because one of the main things that I talk about a lot on this channel is the importance of trying to be an ethical business owner, one of the things I really like as well about Vite Ramen is everything is made in the USA, that it is a company that is striving to have ethical business practices, that cares a lot about paying everyone a living wage, providing everyone with benefits. So it always is really nice to be able to shout out a business on my channel that really seems to be doing it right. If you're interested in trying Vite Ramen for yourself, click the link in my description below where you can get yourself a bundle of ramen that includes free shipping throughout the contiguous United States. Click on that link or type in viteramen.com/savvy where you can use my code SAVVY at checkout to get 10% off your order. I really hope you enjoy Vite Ramen as much as I've been, and I hope it helps you save some time cooking and get more daily protein just like it has for me. So that's viteramen.com/savvy or click that link in my description below, and don't forget to use the code SAVVY at checkout for 10% off. Now, let's get back to our video. What's up, my fellow small business supporters? I'm Savvy, and welcome back to Savvy Writes Books. This is the channel where we talk about books in business, and I especially love topics like today because it allows me to talk about books and the book industry along with bringing in some professional experiences I've had working in the education system as well as in book publishing and things like that. It really gets me excited to talk about these topics, but also a little sad when the topic is something like book banning, which is something I'm very against overall. If you are new to this channel, but you like the types of topics that I talk about, please don't forget to subscribe because multiple times a week I put out new videos along the lines of these type of topics. And if you're interested in learning more about the work I've done as a writer, the work I've done as a teacher, the work I've done in the book publishing and business world, please consider joining my Patreon page. Patreon supporters' names are up on the screen right now, so thank you so much to all of my Patreon supporters for continuing to support this channel and making this channel just a really awesome place for me and for you guys. Please check out the description below, everyone, where my $5 and up a month Patreon supporters are linked. They're allowed to link their own store or channel or social media page or cause or whatever they want to promote in my description. So please go ahead and take a look at that as well. And then if you're interested in getting some behind the scenes blog posts, some additional looks at kind of more personal side of what I'm doing and what I've learned from a lot of things and getting access to all of that type of content, please consider joining my Patreon page as well. So check that out. But in the meantime, let's talk about some of the controversies that have sprung up just within the past few months surrounding this concept of book banning and what it overall means for our education system. So I think the article I'd like to start with today is going to be one from the New York Times from just this past December, so just a couple months ago now, and this is called "A Fast-Growing Network of Conservative Groups is Fueling a Surge in Book Bans." Now, I don't want this video to overall be politically motivated, and while the majority of book bans I think we're going to be talking about are books that are challenged by more right-leaning type of people and type of groups, people who are trying to get rid of LGBTQ books and things like that. That's not to say that this is solely a right-wing issue. There are definitely people that ban books for a variety of reasons, and we are going to take a look at an ABC article in a second as well about the differences between right-leaning book bans and left-leaning book bans and what they look like. I mean, spoiler alert, I'm pretty much against all book bans regardless because I think literature is extremely important for education, and even if it is literature that is harmful or that has promoted bad ideology, I think it is still good to know about it and to be able to look at it as a source material and read critically. You've probably noticed on this channel, if you've been here for a while, that I review a lot of books that I dislike. I review a lot of books that I like on this channel too, but I review a lot of books about, you know, hustle culture and how to be an MLM boss babe guru, and books about, sometimes I've even reviewed like right-leaning children's books and things like that. And I would never call for these books not to exist. Rather, I think it's important to be able to see what these ideas are that people are wanting to share and be able to engage with them and say, hey, this is why I disagree with this is why this actually doesn't work, and to use those books as a topic to engage in conversation. So overall, I think we can acknowledge something having existed that's harmful, but also critique it and engage with it with our critical thinking, and I think that's especially important for kids' education as they're developing. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about where some of the nuances in this issue may lie. A fast-growing network of conservative groups is fueling a surge in book bans. Some groups are new, some are long-standing, some are local, others national. Over the past 2 years, they have become vastly more organized, well-funded, effective, and criticized. So let's see what's going on here. The Keller Independent School District just outside of Dallas passed a new rule in November. It banned books from its libraries that include the concept of gender fluidity. So this is a school district outside of Dallas. It says independent school district. I'm assuming it's not a public school because of that, which I guess means legally there's no issue with that because it's not like the government is banning the book. At the same time, I don't necessarily think this is a beneficial move to put a blanket ban on books that include certain topics, because the concept of gender fluidity, well, that means various different things in different contexts. And in a lot of cases, it is important for people to be able to learn things. And another thing we're going to talk about here is this concept of scaffolding, which is the idea that, like, when you are engaging with someone in an educational type of way, you don't just like throw all these terms and ideas that they might not be familiar with at them, but rather you start with where they are, you start with what they know, you meet them where they are, speak the same language as them, and then say, okay, well, this is what I mean when I say this word, so now we can agree on a common meaning, and then we can move forward using the same language. That tends to be a huge problem that I see in what divides people ideologically is using different language, having different words mean different things, having things be dog whistles that the other side can't completely hear and can't understand what you're actually trying to say in that situation. Which is yet another reason that I think literacy and reading and books and gaining a variety of perspectives through literature is so important, because when we become these groups that are segmented in echo chambers, it often becomes hard to remember what people outside of our own experience, what they talk like, what their experiences are. And the more we can broaden that, the more comprehensive of an education students are going to get. So, I think that was a bad move of them to ban these books, very obviously. Let's continue. The change was pushed by 3 new school board members elected in May with support from Patriot Mobile, a self-described Christian cell phone carrier. I'm sorry, I don't know why that's so funny, Christian cell phone. Okay. Through its political action committee, Patriot Mobile poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Texas school board races to promote candidates with conservative views on race, gender, and sexuality, including on which books children can access at school. Traditionally, debates over what books are appropriate for school libraries have taken place between a concerned parent and a librarian or administrator, and resulted in a single title or a few books being reevaluated and either removed or returned to shelves. So that's the main types of examples I've seen in the past, is what it's talking about here. Like I've said before, I've worked with Banned Books Week when working with libraries, when working with schools, and things like that, and often the books we hear about that have been banned, or that have been removed from the library, or have been challenged, that's another category that people talk about, which is usually when a parent or a member of the community speaks one-on-one with an administrator and says, hey, I don't like that this book is being promoted to our kids, can we get rid of it? And that's the challenge, and then whether they remove it or not will determine whether or not the book becomes banned versus just challenged. But recently, the issue has been supercharged by rapidly growing and increasingly influential constellation of conservative groups. The organizations frequently describe themselves as defending parental rights. Some are new and some are long-standing, but with a recent focus on books. Some work at the district and state level, others have national reach, and over the past 2 years or so, they have grown vastly more organized, interconnected, well-funded, and effective. So this is saying that there's more of a concerted effort to getting rid of certain books now, which is extremely concerning, right? People talk a lot about book burning as a thing. I'm not against book burning in terms of like the physical act of lighting a book on fire. I think using paper for fire is not like a bad action in and of itself. It fully depends on the context that you're doing it in, right? But to see like concerted efforts of groups of people to get rid of certain books, I generally don't like that. And you guys know there are a lot of books that I don't like in this world, but I would never call for those books to be banned or to be removed from public consciousness. Rather, I would just say, here's why I don't like this book and why I personally didn't like reading it. I think there's a huge difference there between that and trying to get the content removed so that people don't have access to it in the first place. Remember, we talk all the time on this channel about how that's one of the key tenets to how cults form, is information control.
Mind control.
And I'm not saying these groups are cults. I'm just saying that that is a key tenet to how cults form, so we should probably watch out. The groups have pursued their goals by becoming heavily involved in local and state politics, where Republican efforts have largely outmatched liberal organizations in many states for years. They have created political action committees, funded campaigns, endorsed candidates, and packed school boards, helping to fuel a surge in challenges to individual books and to drive changes in the rules governing what books are available to children. This is not about banning books, it's about protecting the innocence of children, said Keith Flogg, one of the founders of Florida Citizens Alliance, a conservative group focused on education and letting parents decide what the child gets rather than having government schools indoctrinate our kids. So this is the part that I don't fully understand, is where this whole idea of this is the government indoctrinating our kids comes from. I remember when I have worked in libraries, when I've been in school libraries and things like that, there are a variety of books available. It isn't like they're trying to indoctrinate you with one ideology. It's like there are a lot of different books available and you can read different things and gain different perspectives. So yes, there may be books about socialism, but there may also be books about capitalism. I just chose those two because they're two economic ideologies that tend to fall on different ends of the spectrum, even though they're not polar opposites in every way. But my point is, it's not like the books are going to indoctrinate you in the sense, like earlier I was talking about gender fluidity. Okay, let's say that there are books available in the library about being part of the LGBTQ community.
What? That's so fucking gay.
That does not mean that that's all there's going to be. There will also also be books about straight people, and there will also be books, I mean, the overwhelming majority of romances within books are male-female, right? So you'll still have books like that, and that's just talking about fiction. When we look at nonfiction, of course books are going to address all types of people. So my point is, it's not indoctrination, it's just providing more books. And I don't see how more books is ever a negative thing.
No more pencils, no more books.
And I remember I even contested something once when I was working with Banned Books Week, right? To talk about the importance of not banning books. At this point, this was like, I want to say 2018 or so. And someone said, okay, Bill Cosby's book has recently been banned because Bill Cosby has been charged with the assault of many women. And overall, a lot of people have a lot of very valid concerns with Bill Cosby as a person. And when someone brought that up, like, okay, well, Bill Cosby's book is an example of a book that's been banned. And one person who was representing the organization said, yeah, some books are banned for good reasons. And I disagreed with them on that. My whole point here is that I'm consistent. I disagreed, and I said, I don't think there is such a thing as a good reason to ban a book. I think that every book exists as a piece of history. It exists as a piece of the information that was available at the time or someone's account of said information. And you can introduce a book with the proper education. Now, does that mean that I think little kids should be reading about Bill Cosby? No, not necessarily. But then again, that's where scaffolding comes in. That's where we need to determine what is appropriate at what age level. And then you get into the whole mess of, well, who gets to determine that? Is it each child's individual parents? Is it the government? And if each child's individual parents get to determine it and there's not allowed to be any government intervention, well, schools are publicly funded. Are you calling for the end of funding to public schools because there's going to be a school with a library? Are you calling for the end to the library? Like, when you take any of these ideas too far or try to look at any of this in a black and white type of way, it will easily fall apart because the world is not that simplified. These are very complex topics. But overall, I would say in the overwhelming majority of cases, I think that it's more beneficial to have more books, more literature, more primary and secondary sources out there in the world, because recording history and gaining real perspectives on what was going on at various times throughout the world is the way that we make sense of how we got to the points where we are today and give people a comprehensive education on how the world is the way it is. To call that indoctrination, I think, is so incredibly reductive. The materials the group object to are often described in policies and legislation as sensitive, inappropriate, or pornographic. In practice, the books most frequently targeted for removal have been by or about Black or LGBTQ people, according to the American Library Association. Okay, so it links to another article from the New York Times that I can't read because it's a paywall. Thanks, bud. In Texas, 11 school board candidates backed by Patriot Mobile Action, the political action committee formed by the cell phone company, won in 4 districts this year, including Keller. The committee's aim is to eliminate critical race theory and LGBTQ indoctrination from schools. Lee Wamgans, its executive director, said on Steve Bannon's show War Room. So a lot of times I find this really interesting. If you look there's a lot of videos out there on social media of people going up to people on the street and saying, do you support critical race theory being taught in schools? And a lot of times the person will say, no, I don't support it being taught in schools. And they'll be like, okay, which parts of it do you object to? And that person will kind of draw a blank usually. And I'm not saying this is true in 100% of cases. I'm sure there are people out there who could think of reasons that they don't want it being taught. But my point is that the majority of people who say that they're against critical race theory don't really understand what it is. So for some background information, critical race theory is part of the concept of critical theory, which is usually taught at the college level as a way of analyzing like sociological happenings and things like that. Critical race theory, or any type of critical theory, is not normally taught at the elementary school level. What people mean when they say they want to give kids an education about what racism is and what that means is usually that when we're teaching U.S. history in an elementary school classroom, we're not going to skip over the parts about slavery. We're not going to skip over the parts where someone was racially discriminated against. We're not going to skip over those things and pretend that the U.S. has been a great country all along, because it hasn't. No country has. Every country in existence has a history with some really terrible things in it. And it's important that we acknowledge those things, because if we pretend those things didn't exist, that's not an honest account of what's happening, and that is a detriment to our students' education. So I think a lot of times when people want to have an education that includes learning about racism, that's not to say that you're going to be teaching kids these extremely advanced topics that they're not capable of understanding at their age. It's to say that you're going to be teaching kids in a scaffolded way that meets them where they are. You're going to teach them what happened in U.S. history, what the consequences of that were, where those consequences may still play out today, what things have been done to try to rectify those things and what things haven't. Basically, it's all about having an honest conversation and teaching people an accurate representation of what history is. So it's generally with like history that people have an issue with that. When it comes to LGBTQ indoctrination, what people mean when they say that varies wildly because I have not heard like one consistent definition of it yet. It's more so, from what I hear, people seem to be under the impression that if kids learn about LGBTQ people existing, that somehow that's indoctrination. But I think that if you hide from someone the reality of an entire demographic of people existing in the world, that seems more like indoctrination to me because you're actively lying or lying by omission. You're actively concealing something. That's kind of how I see it. Even books without sexual content can be problematic if they include LGBTQ characters because they're sexualizing children, she said. It's normalizing a lifestyle that is a sexual choice. So this is the rhetoric we used to hear back in the 90s, right? Is being gay a choice? Is being part of the LGBTQ community a choice, or is it part of who you are? Now, my stupid ass over here thought that in the early 2010s was when it was pretty widely accepted that it was not a choice, right? That it's just a demographic like anything else. Being white, being black, being Asian, or any type of race or ethnicity, those are not choices, right? I didn't choose to be born white. That is a demographic that I am a part of. I didn't choose to be a woman. That is a demographic that I am a part of. And I thought for a while people had finally understood that being LGBTQ was just a demographic like anything else, that if you're gay, that's just the demographic that you're a part of. It's not a choice that you made for yourself. I guess you could say you can choose to marry someone of the same gender. That's a choice that you make. But I could say the same thing like, oh, you're a Christian. It's a choice that you choose to go to church. But a lot of Christians would say, well, like, no, it's not a choice. That's the demographic I'm a part of. That is my life. That is important to me as a person. Yeah, people have things that are important to a part of who they are. That is just a demographic they belong to. I'm not in favor of religious discrimination either, guys. I'm not in favor of discrimination of any kind. So to say that it is sexualizing children is disgusting. First of all, I am so against the exploitation of children in any way. That's a thing I've talked on this channel about so many times, especially when reviewing books about children who have been in the media, especially when talking about family vloggers, about unethical things like that. The exploitation of children is one thing that makes my blood boil. So when I see people taking this concept of the exploitation of children and minimizing it like this, and taking a look at a book that does nothing wrong and calling it exploitative to children or harmful to children, when there are actual child predators out there and there are lots of people out there actually doing really harmful things to children, to put this on that level is so ridiculous and frankly insulting to people who are actually out there trying to protect children from predators, right? There is nothing sexualizing inherently in a book about LGBTQ people. I will say, I've written LGBTQ books with sex scenes in them before, and I would never give them to a child. In fact, I mark them as, don't read this if you're under 18, and when it gets sorted into Amazon, Amazon will not sell it to anyone under 18, right? Like things like that. I've also written stories with straight people that have sex scenes in them and also wouldn't sell them to people under 18. It's all about the content of the book itself, not the demographics of the characters or the demographics of the people that the book is talking about. Otherwise, is it sexualizing to children that they can see Disney princesses kissing a prince in the movie? Is, for a lot of people, kissing can be a sexual act, so is that showing children sexual material that they see Snow White kiss the prince? A lot of people would say no, and the reason they'd say no is that it's a man and a woman. So suddenly when it's two people of the same gender, they have a massive issue with it. That just shows that they are discriminating against LGBTQ people and not looking at the situation as what it actually is. And that's really upsetting to me. Those kinds of lifestyles shouldn't be forced down the throats of families who don't agree. Forcing things down my throat is not my fetish, so I get it. That was a joke because obviously it's not forcing something on someone to have material available about it existing. In fact, you're the one trying to force schools to remove that material, so you're forcing it so if I don't want it, that means nobody gets to have it. You're the one doing the forcing in that case. By August, about 3 months after the new members were seated, the Keller School Board had restricted or prohibited books containing profanity, violence, sex scenes, or nudity. These changes resulted in the removal of at least 20 books from the district schools, including Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and several young adult novels with LGBTQ characters like Adam Silvera's More Happy Than Not. Handmaid's Tale, I'm guessing they wanted removed because Handmaid's Tale is not very pro-life, if you know what I'm saying. In November, the board added the ban on books that refer to gender fluidity. Lainey Hawes, who has 4 children in Keller schools, was there that day. She and some other parents felt outflanked, she said, by deep-pocketed organizations whose actions can change long-standing policies in a matter of months. So, I get this. So she's over here saying, like, okay, I have kids in this school too. Why do the opinions of these organizations that have banded together, why should they matter more than my opinion? Like, if they don't want their kids reading that, just tell their kids not to read it. Why do my kids not get access to it because this person doesn't want their kids to have access to it? Like, why are they enforcing that on me? They ran on the campaign of, we're going to get pornography and sexually explicit books out of our school libraries, Ms. Hawes said. The parents didn't have a pack. We couldn't compete with these people. So that's also the fact that they're falsely framing this as an issue of books being sexually explicit, which I agree, children should not be reading sexually explicit books. But there's no proof that these books were sexually explicit, and in a lot of cases, these people are saying directly, like, no, we just think anything LGBTQ is inherently sexually explicit because whatever. I don't understand that. Individuals and groups opposing book restrictions say crafting a national response is difficult since policies are set locally, but some are pushing back. The restrictions, say Emerson Sykes, a First Amendment litigator for the Civil Liberties Union, infringes on students' right to access a broad range of material without political censorship. The ACLU and other advocacy groups filed a federal civil rights complaint against the Keller School District, arguing that banning books about gender fluidity creates a pervasively hostile atmosphere for LGBTQ students. Librarians in Texas formed the Freedom Fighters, an organization that offers guidance to librarians on handling book challenges. In Florida, parents who oppose book banning formed the Freedom to Read Project, which encourages its members to attend board meetings and tracks the work of groups like the Florida Citizens Alliance. We're trying to document the censorship movement, said Stefana Farrell, one of the founders of Freedom to Read. They don't want us to use the word ban. Instead, they remove, relocate, restrict, all these words that aren't banned, but it's a ban. So shout out to these people who are trying to keep the libraries having lots of stuff. According to a recent report from the free speech organization PEN America, there are at least 50 groups across the country working to remove books that they object to from libraries. Some have seen explosive growth recently. Of the 300 chapters that PEN tracked, 73% were formed after 2020. So this is really a new phenomenon, right? Like I was saying earlier, a lot of the work that I did around Banned Books Week efforts with various schools and libraries and things like that was in 2017, 2018, years like that. So this was before, like, Banned Books Week was a thing before. I remember being a kid in middle school and high school and having my librarians talk about Banned Books Week and talk about the importance of having access to a wide variety of types of literature. But now we're seeing that a huge explosion, it's more than doubled just since 2020, of groups making a concerted effort to try to remove as many books as possible. So this isn't just the same stuff we've been seeing before. There has been a much greater effort recently to explicitly restrict students' access to various types of books. The growth comes in part from the rise of parental rights organizations during the pandemic. Formed to fight COVID restrictions in schools, some groups adopted a broader conservative agenda focused on opposing instruction on race, gender, and sexuality, and on removing books they regard as inappropriate. Other groups, like the Florida Citizens Alliance, have been around for years. Established in 2013, the alliance has long-standing ties to Governor Ron DeSantis. Its co-founders, Mr. Flogg and Pastor Rick Stevens, served on the DeSantis Transition Committee. The group has worked on a variety of issues over time, partnering with over 100 other groups, including Moms of Liberty and Americans for Prosperity Florida, a local branch of a national group founded by billionaires Charles and David Koch. So this is basically, this whole debate is coming down to, do parents or teachers have more of a right to determine what your kids are learning? And that's a really difficult place to be in, because we're all humans and all humans are inherently flawed, right? All of us are fallible. None of us are perfect. The idea behind public school, right, is that everybody has access to an education, that by virtue of being a human being, everyone has an inherent right to get an education and to have access to the potential social mobility that can come from gaining an education and the ability to work certain jobs and things like that.
Michael, I have rights.
So when you have a public school system, you can get parents who are like, well, it's my taxes that fund the public school. This is my child that you're teaching. So shouldn't I have a say in what's being taught? But then you have teachers who say, okay, well, I'm a professional in education. I've studied education all these years. I work with people who know how kids learn best. And yes, you're their parent, but how much of a say should you have to infringe on what I know is going to be beneficial for teaching your kids? Why even be part of the public school system if you just want to do it yourself? So this whole thing is just the more of like the whole parents' rights idea is more and more just like parents want to be able to control what their kids learn at school. And that doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that you would take advantage of a public education system, but also want to change what's in that system. I don't know. I don't like it. I don't think it's beneficial to kids as a whole. I think having kids learn from professionals in education is generally the best way to go about it. And that's not to say that teachers are perfect. I've had some shit teachers in my life. There have been some corrupt administrators, especially in the Chicago Public School District. I get it. But at the same time, this is not the way to go about it.
This is the way.
Not.
Because this article primarily focuses on right-wing banning of books, which often comes from an anti-LGBTQ angle, and often an angle about not wanting kids to learn about the realities of racism as well, especially because they want to frame it as this perspective of the US has always been a wonderful country, we've been great from the beginning, and not wanting kids to see some of the realities of that. That's not to say that banning books is solely a right-wing effort, so I wanted to take a look at another article, this one from ABC News, called How Conservative and Liberal Book Bans Differ Amidst Rise in Literary Restrictions. The country saw a growing effort to ban books in schools and libraries nationwide in 2022, and researchers expect to see more efforts to challenge books in 2023 as some Republican-backed laws across the country aim to restrict LGBTQ and racial content in school books. While activists across the political spectrum have sought to restrict or protest some form of literature, the vast majority of book challenges are from conservative-leaning groups, researchers say. Only a handful of efforts have also come from liberal sources, mainly targeting books with racist or offensive language. If you get 5 people and they walk through a library and they're allowed to remove anything they think might get someone in trouble for being there, well, they're going to start pulling all kinds of stuff. A conservative person and a progressive person, Jonathan Friedman, the director of free expression and education programs at PEN America, told ABC News. We all have different issues that we think shouldn't be in books. Historic representations of racism, for example, something like Mark Twain, is just as likely to be seen as potentially controversial as is Genderqueer, a coming-of-age memoir about the author's LGBTQ identity. So that's a thing we've been seeing a lot lately too, right? We see these two sides often, and this may come from the ways that social media promotes the most extreme content as a way to divide us and get as many views as possible. But we will see, the Ben Shapiro types, the conservative commentators on the internet talking about how it's really the left who wants to burn books, who wants to get rid of books, who wants to censor us because they wanted to get rid of racial slurs being used in a Mark Twain book. Or recently, the news about Roald Dahl and some of his books being rewritten to be more politically correct, I guess would be the term. And they'll say like, okay, so clearly it's the left who wants to destroy literature and erase history. And then you get people on the left who say, well, people on the right are trying to remove books that teach about the realities of what racism in the US used to be like and still is like today. They're trying to get rid of books that explain and acknowledge that the LGBTQ community exists. They're the ones trying to erase history and trying to police literature and things like that. You guys know that I'm not in favor of censorship of literature in any way. I personally don't think that it's helpful. When it comes to books like Mark Twain's books, which often have racial slurs in them, as that is commonly the way people spoke at that time, I can understand why people may be uncomfortable reading that, especially if you're someone who is, a Black student, why reading that might make you feel really uncomfortable. And I think that that's why if those books, I don't necessarily think those books need to be assigned in schools. I think it's time that we change up the books we're assigning to kids in schools, because a lot of, you can still read some classic literature, but a lot of literature kids don't connect to in the same way as they would have in decades past, so I do think it's time to change some of that up. But that doesn't mean I would say that, Huckleberry Finn or something shouldn't be allowed to be in the library. I think it should absolutely be allowed to be in the library. I think that the more communication and the more words we use to communicate with each other and to understand each other, usually the better, right? So if you have a book like Huckleberry Finn, have a page in the front or have a librarian talk to a kid ahead of time and say, hey, just so you know, the book does contain this type of content. It may be uncomfortable to read, but let's have a discussion. Let's have some education about how that used to be what the world was like, and let's talk about the ways that the world has improved since then and why that isn't acceptable now and things like that. You can use it as a learning tool. And again, that doesn't mean that you should be giving Huckleberry Finn to like a 5-year-old child, right? Because not only are they not going to be able to understand it, but they may not be ready for that full, complete conversation about that yet, which is again where scaffolding comes in and why we need to look at things in context with certain circumstances rather than doing a blanket, this book shouldn't exist type of thing. This book shouldn't be accessible to our kids. That is so reductive. We really need to look at things more in context and on a case-by-case basis. But so that's an example of how, like, someone that is left-leaning. Lately, I've been seeing this whole thing about Roald Dahl, right? Author of Matilda, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, The Witches, James and the Giant Peach, bunch of books I loved to read as a kid. A lot of those books were getting reprinted with certain offensive language taken out of them. And I wasn't necessarily agreeing with this because I think that it can be used as a learning tool to look at in context why things would have been said that way at that time and why we might not say things that way now. But changing it, I don't think is honest. And especially in a lot of cases of what people were changing, it was things that like kind of changed the meaning of the story or changed the meaning of the sentence and didn't keep the original spirit of what he was going for. So I didn't agree with that move. I also didn't agree with a lot of conservative talking heads, you know, people like Ben Shapiro that I saw, who were making fun of the editor who was at the head of changing Roald Dahl's books. There was an editor at the head of this who was part of the LGBT community. And I saw a lot of people making fun of this editor for being an LGBTQ person, which has absolutely nothing to do. I can disagree with the work that this person did in how they changed the text of a book, but I can also say you shouldn't bully this person for their identity, for their demographics. That's absolutely wrong. I think there's a lot of situations where we're seeing multiple things being wrong at once, and it's very frustrating. But those are some examples that I've seen of more left-leaning types of people trying to censor literature. But as this article points out, a lot of the cases of big groups that are coming together and big groups that are doing these concerted pushes to actually get books removed from libraries, to actually make these big impacts, often do tend to be more right-leaning groups. Specifically, we're seeing groups of people that are supportive of Ron DeSantis, that are tied in with him in his campaigns and things like that. So that's, I think, extremely frustrating, especially as a LGBTQ person myself who really needed those books a lot when I was growing up. We're in danger of removing from libraries all kinds of material, some are which is seen as classic forms of literature, and some are now in danger of not becoming classic works of literature because they're being censored this way, Friedman said. According to the American Library Association, most book challenges fail to remove books from classroom or library shelves completely. However, any book that is challenged is considered to be a banned book. So that's another topic that we didn't really get into yet, but what does it mean for a book to be banned? As a lot of people point out, sometimes calling them banned books can be a little bit of a misnomer because these books are not being banned in a First Amendment violation kind of way. It's not the government saying, okay, we are shutting down this publisher for putting out this book. We are forcibly removing this book from stores and from libraries under threat of legal action. That's not usually what it is, right? What it usually is someone saying, I don't want this book in my child's library. Let's get a group of people together on a local level to get it removed, or to at least try to get it removed. And then that leads into this whole discussion about what is platforming, what deserves a platform, and what deserves a platform in a government-funded institution like a public school. Because some people have talked about books being like soft banned, which is just kind of a school or a library choosing not to stock that book in the first place. And so I can turn around and say something like, when I first released my book series, Forever Home Friends, I talked to the Chicago Public Library system about getting the books stocked in there, and they didn't want to take any new books because it was an overload on their system other than books that were recommended from Booklist, which is how publicly funded libraries, usually they take their recommendations from Booklist, not always though. So I had that discussion and I'm like, okay, have my books been soft banned? Because a library intentionally chose not to stock them. They chose not to stock them, not because of anything to do with the content of the books, but because they were not looking to buy books from a small business owner. They were looking to buy books that were published by publishers that are recommended in Booklist. So that's more of an issue of, I guess, how business dealings work. Is capitalism a system that inherently bans books? Like, then we get into this whole, like, philosophical discussion of what that means, and I don't think there's one clear answer to that. That's why these discussions can become a little bit difficult to have, because these books aren't really being banned in necessarily a legal sense, but they are being banned in the sense that they're trying to get removed from schools. And when that is because of the content, then that is in a lot of cases due to censorship, which I am always against. But I do understand how someone may come into this argument and not fully understand what it means to say that something is banned in that way. But for the scope of this video and for the sake of keeping this mostly focused, I think we're going to focus on just books that have been banned or have been challenged or removed from a library due to their content and due to parents and organizations and political groups intentionally trying to get them removed, rather than just this whole concept of like, well, if someone chooses not to stock a book because they don't like the publisher or because they don't get a good deal with the publisher, isn't that like a financial form of banning of books? And that's kind of a separate topic, and I think it's important to talk about, but I just don't want to get too far off topic. What content is being targeted? Books targeted by conservative groups were overwhelmingly written by or about people of color and LGBTQ people, according to anti-censorship researchers. According to PEN America and the ALA, many of these challengers reference the sexual content or inherent messages of the books. So as we were talking about earlier, when there were people saying, oh, any book with LGBTQ characters is automatically sexual, which is not true. That's not true. Banned books from the ALA show these groups have challenged young adult books such as The Hate U Give and The Bluest Eye, which deal with racism in the United States, as well as book titles like Genderqueer and All Boys Aren't Blue, which discuss LGBTQ identities, sexuality, and gender. So The Hate U Give, that's one that I've heard being challenged a lot. Fantastic book, by the way. Highly recommend it. It deals with racism and police brutality. And I think a lot of people, I guess, thought it was offensive for some reason. It's a really good book that deals with these issues in, I think, ways that make a lot of sense and resonate with teen readers a lot. Meanwhile, liberal efforts criticize or restricted books in the name of anti-racism or progressive ideals. And so there we've got Huckleberry Finn as an example. Books like Of Mice and Men, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and several Dr. Seuss titles have been challenged in some schools and libraries due to racist language or imagery throughout the years, including use of the N-word or insensitive imagery of racial stereotypes. Where are book banning efforts coming from? The conservative effort is coming from legislators and conservative political groups like Moms for Liberty and No Left Turn in Education, PEN America found. These organizations say they aim to give parents more of a say about what children read in the classroom or preserve principles of liberty or freedom, according to their websites. I think that's so hypocritical that there's people out there being like, we want freedom and liberty to police what everyone in the school district gets to read. How is that freedom or liberty? That's not freedom. That's you saying, don't I have the freedom to take away your freedom? At some point, this just becomes a straight up paradox. I recommend, if you guys want to see me go into more of kind of like the philosophical angles behind this, I did a book review in early 2022 about Ben Shapiro's book, The Authoritarian Moment, where I talked about this idea of the paradox of absolute freedom. You can't have absolute freedom because having a freedom will always end up infringing on another freedom to something else. And I talk about it a lot in there. So I highly recommend watching that video if you want more of that discussion. But I just think it's extremely hypocritical that they're like, in the name of freedom, we're going to take away books. We're going to censor things more. Gross. Legislative efforts in states like Florida, Utah, Missouri, Texas, and more have also aimed to restrict the lessons and content educators could teach that include certain perspectives on race, gender, and sexual orientation in the classroom. Florida's Parental Rights and Education Law, and others like it nationwide, is aimed at removing LGBTQ content and identities from being discussed in the classroom, while laws like New Hampshire's prohibit divisive concepts on race and gender in the classroom. So this is a lot of what we've seen with the Don't Say Gay bill, all of that kind of stuff, people trying to make it so that kids don't have access to learning about LGBTQ people existing, or kids are not allowed to learn about things regarding racism, even though that is a huge part of US history and European history and a lot of places history, right? You're basically cutting things out of the curriculum. A lot of people will complain about things being like 1984. I feel like we're being censored like 1984. And then you end up in this situation where it's like, well, you're the one who wants to do the censoring now. You're the one who's trying to erase the history. That seems really hypocritical to me. I also found this article on Insider called Book Bans and Restrictions Are a Losing Issue for Republicans. I thought this was interesting, especially because this article only came out a couple weeks ago, so it's very new, and I wanted to take a look at its analysis on this. State GOP leaders have enacted laws or pushed for banning children from accessing certain books in school classrooms and libraries, and polling shows banning books is popular among Republicans. But the issue could come back to haunt the GOP in the 2024 general election, with book bans remaining unpopular with the general electorate. According to a recent survey from YouGov, which polled 1,000 adult American citizens and had a standard deviation of 3.5%, the majority of Republican respondents, 58%, said that there's a time and place for public school classrooms or libraries to ban books or novels. The survey comes months after Florida's Republican-led legislature passed 3 high-profile laws in 2022, leading some public school classrooms to temporarily shutter their libraries, as a select few media specialists have been tasked with reviewing tens of thousands of books to assure they're age-appropriate. And in Texas, school administrators in at least 20 school districts banned more than 800 books, the vast majority of which pertain to sexuality or race, with many of the bans arising after former state representative Matt Krause sent an inquiry to school district to see if they had copies of the books in question. Independents don't like book bans, Democrats despise them. And while most Republicans polled were in favor of banning books, their Democratic and independent counterparts were not. Nearly half of all Democrats polled by YouGov were against banning books from school libraries for any reason. I might need to look at that poll a little more because, okay, 58% of Republicans said there's a time and a place for banning, said that they are okay with banning books, and then it said nearly half of Democrats said they're not okay with it. That sounds like the same percentage, right? It's 58% and 42%. Wouldn't that be basically the same percentage on both the right and the left? Am I completely misinterpreting the survey? Or is this article just, like, really deceptively framing it? I don't know. So then we get this chart that kind of shows it a little more, like, who wants to ban what, right? Like anti-police messaging, for example. So the question asked is, do you think books should be banned from public schools if they cover the following topic? Like, a lot more Republicans than Democrats or independents are going to say that a book with anti-police messaging. So I guess I wouldn't say a book like The Hate U Give has anti-police messaging. I would just say that it addresses the realities of police brutality as a concept that happens. It talks about like some of the issues within the system of policing, but it's not a book that just says like abolish the police. Like that's not the message of the book. But I guess for the sake of like how someone who is in favor of book banning might interpret this, I think Republicans often might interpret that book as having anti-police messaging. So like gender identity, most Democrats don't think we should ban them. Over half of Republicans do. Discussions of sexual orientation, same thing. I guess these things are very similar, LGBTQIA content, and we see kind of the same thing over and over again. More than half of Republicans want them banned. Almost no Democrats do. Less than half of independents do. So there is definitely, according to this survey, which to be fair is only 1,000 people, so we could probably do a different survey and see different results. However, if we do want to look at this one and look at the trends that it is showing us, for the most part, Republicans are the ones leading the efforts to ban books. I will say in the section about conservative political ideas, that's I think the only category where more Democrats than Republicans wanted it banned. However, the number of Democrats that wanted it banned was still very low. It seems that even when it's conservative ideals, for the most part, Democrats on the whole seem to be more in favor of just not banning books in general. That's what I'm gathering from this. But again, that's a generalization. That's not going to be true for 100% of people. So this article is basically going on to say that if you are trying to ban books and you want to win in a general election, it may not be the best move, considering that while maybe on your side of the issue, people who share your same values might agree with that, the majority of people in general are going to have issues with that. So I can see that. Overall, I think that banning books is a huge disservice to the education system and to the kids who are going to learn from those books. I understand that there are books that may have content that is difficult to digest or that makes you extremely uncomfortable, but that's why we have teachers, that's why we have librarians, that's why we have people who can work with people to understand those topics better and can place those books into an educational context. And I think that that's extremely important. I've always said the more books we have in the world, the better. The more books, the more information, the more perspectives, the more we can gain from learning from each other. And I just want to be clear, that doesn't mean that every book is going to be appropriate for kids. There are plenty of books that are actually not appropriate for kids. But when there are books written with a child audience in mind, and that book doesn't contain explicit violence, explicit sexual content, things like that, and rather is just written with acknowledgement of things that have happened or with demographics of people that do exist, that is not inherently offensive. And to say that it is to just show that you have a prejudice against those groups, which is honestly detrimental to society as a whole, because I believe that we should be celebrating our similarities and our differences as people. We should be gaining as many perspectives on the world as we can, because that's where education and knowledge comes from. Honestly, I think all these people who want to ban books should probably just read more books. That's probably the solution. You need to start reading more books, dude. Let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments below, and if you know of any initiatives that are good for helping to fight the banning of books, please let me know as well, because I will definitely be supporting the effort against banning of books as I have always in the past. I will see you guys again later and next week for more videos, but in the meantime, please continue to support small businesses, support authors, support teachers, support librarians, support all the wonderful people in the world who are making education accessible to kids and adults alike. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!
Let's do it.
Let's do it!
We're on a mission from God.
Because the world is run by the man.
Boom. Roasted.